So the title of my lecture today is Behavioral Science, Cognition and Infodemic Interventions. And I am a social psychologist, and at CDC, I'm sort of kind of grouped into a category of behavioral science. And I'm on the demand for immunization team in the Global Immunization Division at the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. So there's a lot of acronyms in there. But basically, I'm a behavioral scientist on the demand team. I've been working in the area of demand for immunizations for about 4 years. And as we keep going, I'd like to open this up by asking a pretty basic question, which is, what is behavioral science? Some of you in the audience may be behavioral scientists. Some of you may work with behavioral scientists. And some of you may be very new to the concept of behavioral science. I'm kind of speaking to all of you when I say that in the context of public health, behavioral science is defined as the science of conceptualizing, measuring, and changing health behaviors. And it's really all aspects of this definition. You know, when it comes to kind of framing the issue, measuring, and using it to create interventions. And the really unique thing about behavioral science, one of the reasons that I love being a behavioral scientist, is that it draws on many different disciplines and is truly interdisciplinary. So you can have readings, writings, traditions from behavioral economics, communication science, psychology, anthropology, sociology, a number of different disciplines. And so, for instance, I'm a social psychologist, and that's different from a clinical psychologist or a cognitive psychologist or these other subdisciplines within psychology. It's a very rich tradition, and they all kind of bring together accumulation of knowledge that makes up behavioral science. Behavioral science can be further understood as a synthesis of theory, research, and practice. So theory can be considered a set of interrelated concepts that explain behaviors and suggest ways to achieve behavior change. From there, you can have theoretically informed research, which is quantitative or qualitative or both, understanding gained via theoretically informed approaches. And importantly, there's a third angle to this, which is leveraging theoretically informed research for practice, which are interventions to induce positive behavior change, which are also informed by research and theory. So it's this kind of nexus of activity that makes up what behavioral science is. At this point, I could branch off and talk about a number of different behavioral models, behavioral theories like the health belief model or the trans-theoretical model, behavior change, social ecological model. But honestly, when I was creating this, I said, I want to start with a theory that I think has informed the trajectory of how we deal with infodemic management kind of to this point, even if we didn't understand it as infodemic management in the past. And that is the information deficit model. So in the 1970s, social scientists began to understand that there was a significant gap in understanding between what kind of knowledge scientists were putting out into the public from publications, presentations, different ways of generating knowledge, and what the public was understanding in terms of the way the world worked. And there was a gap. And so the scientists who were thinking about trying to understand this were suggesting that it was because of a lack of information or knowledge. And so from there, the natural cure is a one-way communication model where information flows from experts to the public in order to change individual attitudes, beliefs, or behaviors. So that's when you started to see guidance for how health authorities could speak more clearly to the public or disseminate more knowledge, or sort of that model, that one-way model of information flow. So to think about this a little bit, I want to bring it personal to us. So I'm going to take you on a little thought experiment. So just kind of bear with me as we go through this. So I want you to raise your hands, and I can't see you because I've minimized my screen, but raise your hands if you have heard that exercising at least 3 times a week is a great way to stay healthy and fit. So exercising at least 3 times a week. You raise your hand. Okay, now I want you to keep your hands raised if you personally exercise a minimum of 3 times a week every week of your life. So a number of us, myself included, have to put our hands down at this point. And why is that? If we have heard from health authorities, if this is a repeated piece of wisdom that we know has a lot of evidence behind it, why is it that we can't manage to exercise 3 times a week, every week for our entire life? And the answer is because we know that behavior is determined by so much more than knowledge and information. It's also determined by our cultural beliefs, our religion, our emotion, memory, past experiences, maybe logistical factors that would prevent us from engaging in a health behavior that we know is good for us. And now we're at a point where we understand that our behavior can also be influenced by what we now know as the infodemic. I'd like to enter a section of my talk called The Infodemic Has Entered the Chat. And I did learn that some of these slides have been presented, and so I won't dwell on this too much, other than to say that at the World Health Assembly, Dr. Tedros had said, we are not just fighting an epidemic, we're fighting an infodemic. And fake news spreads faster and more easily than this virus is, and is just as dangerous. Importantly, the infodemic is not just on false or misleading information in digital and physical space, but also on too much information or an influx of information that's just hard to process. And this can lead to confusion and risk-taking and harmful behaviors, and ultimately a mistrust in governments and public health response, such as the one that we're seeing today with the coronavirus pandemic and people's understanding and trust in the response to it. So what kinds of information are included in the infodemic? It can range from false to disinformation to harmful information. So we've got false could be misinformation, false or misleading content. Disinformation would be false content as well, but also imposter content, manipulated, fabricated, content that lacks context. So you're just getting a slice of what the story is. Disinformed opinions, manipulated content, and then malinformation, which is deliberate sort of information that's out to harm, like hate speech or harassment or different sort of pieces of malinformation. And we know that this is not benign. The COVID-19 infodemic is causing actual harm, ranging from, ingesting unproven herbal remedies, methanol, cleaning products in the US, and we know that people have died, been hospitalized, have suffered other consequences for the result of having followed false or misleading or harmful content. And of course, we know that the information environment, which you've been hearing a lot about, has changed significantly over the last 100 years and continues to change, just evolve very rapidly. Whereas before we had more encyclopedic knowledge or sort of a more narrow concentration of those who are creating and disseminating knowledge. Now we have the creation and dissemination process is more diffuse. And so in some ways it's more democratic, there's more participation. That also means it's much harder to control and contain where that information flows. And we also know that because of that, everyone can be considered an author, a potential author, editor, and disseminator of information. It's very easy to create a social media post. It's very easy to create a blog or to create content. And it's even easier for us to distribute that. And that's particularly salient among our younger populations who are more adept with the technology. But then, you can see different sharing patterns with age as well. So all this is well and good. We know what the infodemic is, and we know that information creation, dissemination is contributing to what we know as the infodemic. But from a behavioral science perspective, the question is really what effect does the infodemic have on our behavior, our cognition, and the actions that we choose to take? What effect does it actually have? It turns out that there's actually a pretty rich literature that you can look at and think about this question, and sometimes look at the results of studies that have been done decades ago and think about what implication it has for infodemic management. So one of the most famous studies in psychology is Solomon Asch's experiment in 1951, where he had experimental setup where we had a naive participant, that is a participant who is not in on the study, is giving honest answers, And that participant was put in a row of what's considered confederates. And these are people who are in on the study, who know the point, and who are led to give a certain answer. So this naive participant was asked to say, which of the lines on the right, so A, B, or C, matches the length of the target line? Very simple cognitive task. And there is a correct answer, and that's C. A is too short and B is too long. But this person was placed at the end of a row of people who all cited the wrong answer, who all said A or B. And by the time it got to that confederate or that participant at the end, about 75% of participants conformed to the wrong answer at least one over 12 trials. In the control group, where there was no pressure to conform, less than 1% of the participants gave the wrong answer. This is a very famous study because it's very counterintuitive. You would think that you would give the right answer every time, since it's fairly obvious. And it's always been talked about as a study of conformity. But I think you could also see it as a study of misinformation or the contextual influences of misinformation. You have a participant, a long line of people giving misleading information, and it's affecting that individual's behavior. Another way that the infodemic can affect our behaviors or our cognition is through schemas. Cognitive schemas are thought patterns that organize information and relationships between objects and structures. Schemas can be considered to be dynamic and influenced by a range of issues, including beliefs, norms, culture, identities, ideologies, etc. And false or misleading information affects the integrity of cognitive schemas by introducing ambiguity, uncertainty, and doubt, particularly when you come into contact with corrected information later. And these schemas can actually be quite resistant to change, even when false information is later corrected. An illustrative example of this is a study kind of known as like the warehouse fire study. In 1988, so again, a few decades ago, Wilkes and Leatherbarrow asked participants to read about a fictitious warehouse fire. In some of these descriptions, the author mentioned that cans of paint and oil were found in the warehouse. So the implication is that they were maybe the cause of the fire. Further down in the narrative, it was clarified that that was actually an error and the cans of paint and oil were not found at the scene of the fire. However, when participants were asked later, causally, why do you think there was so much smoke? A number of participants cited the cans of flammable substances despite knowing, reading on to the debunked information. And it's because when they were reading the narrative, they were developing a schema of what occurred during the warehouse fire or like a mental model. And the dynamics of that were hard to shake, even when coming into contact with corrective information. The infodemic can affect our cognition through information recall. Misinformation can affect information recall, especially when combined with other types of cognitive biases. So there was a study in 2005 by a researcher named Lewandowski, who also contributed to the Debunking Handbook, which is a really great resource that outlines a lot of these biases. But he looked at the effects of media corrections and retractions during the Iraq War on information recall among Australian, Germans, and Americans. Participants in the study were questioned about true events, events initially presented as fact, but subsequently retracted, and fictional events. And really among the participants, Australian and German participants were able to discount corrected misinformation, but Americans showed a persistence in believing pieces of misinformation even after those were shown to have been retracted or corrected. And we know that the Iraq War holds greater emotional charge for Americans than people in other countries. And so there's ongoing research to understand the role that emotions also play in information recall and the influence of infodemic on cognition. When trying to debunk myths, the research has demonstrated several different types of backfire effects that can occur. And these are familiarity backfire effects, overkill, and worldview backfire effects. The familiarity backfire effect is a cognitive phenomenon in which misinformation is remembered more and remembered as being true even after corrective information is shown. that is supposed to correct that myth. So we've talked about different instances of that throughout this talk, but another example is a study that was done about the flu vaccine, where participants were shown a flyer that had common myths about the flu vaccine and then responses to those myths. And directly afterwards, after viewing the flyer, the participants were asked to separate what are the myths and what are facts, given a list of statements. And right after reading the flyer, most participants were successfully able to parse myths from facts. However, then they introduced a cognitive delay for about 30 minutes and asked the participants again, and they had more trouble remembering what are the myths and what are the facts. And so this demonstrated that familiarity can increase the chance of accepting information as true, even if you actually are trying to do that as an attempt to debunk it. The overkill backfire effect states that information that is easy to process is more likely to be accepted as true. And so the wisdom is a simple myth is more cognitively persuasive than an overcomplicated correction. So if you've got a story that suggests 3 reasons that climate scientists are lying to you versus 21 reasons that you believe in that you should believe in climate change, it's the cognitively less complex idea that's going to grab attention. The worldview backfire effect draws on this understanding that we're all subject to confirmation bias, which is seeking out information that bolsters our worldview. And this can happen actively, can also be sort of a subconscious mechanism, but we do have a worldview, and we do kind of have a filtered information through that worldview. But worldview rigidity can be on a continuum. And for those who are really strongly fixed in their worldviews, being confronted with counter arguments against worldviews can cause your belief in misinformation to be strengthened. So they've looked at ways to talk about climate change. Actually, a lot of this literature on cognitive biases, there's some really interesting work around framing of the climate change issue. And that when you frame, some of our compensatory activities or things we might want to do to offset our climate change, if you talk about it in terms of a tax, it's more likely to provoke a strong resistance than talking about it as like a carbon offset. So you see that language work a little bit better, and it's sort of now more accepted than calling it a tax. So this is a section where I say this looks pretty bad, because it does. And what is it that we can do about it, and the intervention angle? And I'll preface this by saying that, this is really the area, I think, of research that is most in need of great people trying to demonstrate techniques or trying to test out techniques, because this is, although some of our research can span back, we don't have a ton of tools in our toolbox yet of what to do about it. But we do know that we're going to approach this area of science using the information that we have from epidemiology and our epidemiological curve, which shows that we can prepare and monitor for threats, we can detect threats, intervene, and then strengthen our resilience to preventing future attacks. And we've mapped on different areas of infodemic management science that can apply, and that we can use this curve to understand. So measuring and monitoring the impact of infodemics, detecting and understanding the spread and impact, responding and deploying interventions that protect and mitigate, and evaluating those interventions to strengthen the resilience. And I think you've seen this, which is our several of the sub actions that we can take under each stream to really innovate in this area and create ways to measure and monitor and detect, respond to, evaluate, and promote resiliency. But specifically, when it comes to an answer to some of these cognitive biases that I've talked about, there have been some techniques that have been identified to work well, or to be effective in addressing misinformation, focusing on the facts that you wish to communicate rather than focusing too much on the myths or the areas of misinformation themselves. Less is more, keeping your content short, easy to understand, and to the point. So something tweetable, something shareable, something memorable, and using graphics when possible to illustrate the point. We know that correcting misinformation and different types of disinformation is more effective among those who are undecided or who are open to alternatives, rather than focusing on those who are very rigid or fixed in their worldview. So focusing on the kind of the middle, the undecided or the swayable, can pay off more in terms of effectiveness. And we know that messages can be presented in ways that do not threaten worldviews, or that can sort of have a softer landing. And we can fill the gap with alternative explanations that are plausible. So there are techniques that we can use. This is a recently published article called "A Call to Arms for Climate Change: How Military Service Member Concern About Climate Change Can Inform Effective Climate Communication." And this is a really interesting study. I encourage you to read it, where they've talked about how framing matters. Political conservatives were more likely to express concern about climate change when framed as a national security concern, and it was communicated by members of the armed services. So you have content that is kind of palatable, but also channels that are trusted to communicate it. So we've got to find more innovative ways of reaching populations that we want to present an argument to against the misinformation. And then there's social inoculation is another promising approach. It's a theory of conferring resistance to persuasive influence by exposing individuals to a persuasive message that contains a weakened argument against an established attitude, so that individuals can develop resistance against stronger future persuasive attacks. So that's a fairly complex way of saying that we can inoculate audiences against misinformation before it is spread. This inoculation process may make susceptible individuals less likely to accept and spread misinformation. And we can use this, in the field of immunization to promote demand for vaccines by supporting positive, accurate narratives regarding immunization. But we can also think about it beyond that to other types of health behaviors. We know that social inoculation can be gamified. There's a really interesting study from 2019 where Rosenbeek and Linden had players or participants pretend to be fake news producers, and they learned to master 6 main misinformation techniques of polarization, invoking emotions, spreading conspiracy theories, trolling, deflecting blame, and impersonating fake accounts. And their promising results demonstrated that after engaging in this kind of gameplay where they themselves were actually producing, and they saw the ease to which you can produce this kind of information, participants had increased ability to spot and resist misinformation, even after controlling for all kinds of factors you think might affect this, like education, age, political ideology, and cognitive style. When I read this, one of the questions I had was, is this kind of gameplay enough to do one time, or would we need booster shots to have sustained immunity against the effects of the infodemic? So this might be something that we have to engage in over time. So I've taken you through a little bit of some of the history of behavioral science and some of the older studies that may have a role to play in how we understand the infodemic. And so it's good to see behavioral science as both an old but also a new enterprise. So some of the older tradition, but there are so many ways that we can innovate and use the tools that we have to understand the effects of the infodemic. We know that misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation can affect the integrity of our cognitive schemas, lead to incorrect information recall, and can thwart debunking attempts. And really, it's the area of intervention research that I think needs to be more strengthened. We know that approaches like social inoculation and improving the framing of our messages can have a positive impact. But certainly we need more research to identify behavioral approaches that work to counter the infodemic. So that comes to the end of my talk. I'd like to thank you for your attention to this topic that is really important, and feel free to contact me with any questions.
Thank you, Neetu. This is great. I've been saying all along that your lecture is now grounding us in the direction of all of the other practical approaches that we need to be discussing now, as far as how do you create human-centered and behavioral informed interventions going forward. There are a couple of questions on Slido. I'm going to do my best to try and answer. I think they're, I think they're quite a bit complex also, because I've been listening at the Infodemiology conference how complex behavioral science is, but I'll do my best. So here's one related to the backfire effect. And, you know, recently there's been recent studies that haven't been able to replicate the backfire effect. So there's this two approaches of thinking about it. Does this change the way that we communicate and address misinformation? You know, whether or not you consider backfire effect, the risk of backfire effect or not? What do you think?
So I guess I need to know more about which backfire effects they're referring to, or which studies. I mean, there is a replication problem in psychology, and it's because, well, there's a lot of reasons, but I think one of the main issues is that a lot of this psychological literature, even the ones, you know, from the 1950s that I was talking about, like decades ago, they have very homogenous participant population. They are generally like, especially in a lot of the studies are done on undergraduates, or like, you know, undergraduate populations, certain demographics, and we don't have a huge amount of generalizable knowledge to how different populations, how different subpopulations of different communities react to misinformation. So things that are presented, you know, as like phenomenon, this is definitely what happens. I think that we have to take a step back from that and understand that we do need to replicate these phenomenon in different populations. And I think psychology is trying to change the way that it functions in order to do that. So I wouldn't be surprised to know that some of these things don't hold up consistently and are not generalizable. And I think that just means we have to do better and more innovative research to understand what are generalizable principles. Are there any? Are there ways that we react that we can predict? Because it's all about prediction, actually. It's all about trying to predict behavior. And if we can't do that well, then we're really stuck. So I think the answer is not to discount to completely, but to try to improve our methods to see what matters and what applies and what doesn't. So it's a really good question.
Yeah, I guess this is the same as for any model of behavior change with regards to misinformation and how it affects behavior, because we really actually don't know all of the levers to really build it, or, you know, we can build a model, but we need to test it as well. There's two more, I guess, reference questions for you. If you could share any theories of behavior change or you could point people to some reference material they could read up on. For example, behavior change wheel or any other references. And there's another question: which institutes or organizations are currently doing behavior change or social inoculation research in different social political settings? If you could point us to some organizations where people could research further. This could also be done after the fact. You can just email us the references if that's easier.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. I mean, I know that, so there's an enormous amount of literature on behavior change models and traditions of behavior change and, you know, theories, et cetera. That's a very old, very, very kind of storied literature. But in terms of the approaches that are being applied to misinformation or infodemic, that's relatively new. I'm sorry, the second thing you said was
organizations that may be doing research.
Social inoculation. I think this is, and this is also sort of relatively new. I mean, our team is actually looking at this issue in Indonesia, and so we've got some like new research initiatives looking at that. But in terms of like an academic unit that's dedicating a lot of time to that, I'm gonna have to look into that and see who's. But I would actually look at that 2019 article that I mentioned, because that got a lot of press and a lot of attention when that was published.
Yeah, actually, we probably will see infodemics as part of the research when it comes to social inoculation and behavioral science, very likely in the future. Okay, so this is probably another difficult question. I'll just read it through. And this is the last one, guys. Is there any way or recommendation that for how do we convince people to filter or rationalize information to get away from prejudice, to stop their prejudicial behavior or their harmful health behaviors? What would be some examples of interventions that may work, and maybe easiest is to explain on vaccine demand, actually.
Yeah, and that's true because, you know, a lot of our work is focused on the vaccine example. And I think, okay, so let's take the example of the COVID-19 vaccines. And we know that a lot of the concerns are emerging from vaccine, the realm of vaccine safety and efficacy. So people questioning whether these vaccines are safe or efficacious, whether the processes have been sped up. You know, there's like legitimate reasons that people want to know more. So one of the things we've been thinking about is trying to demystify the vaccination, you know, approval journey. What does it take for something to go through vaccine trials to then be authorized for use in the public, and trying to be transparent about what it is that we know and that we don't know about the vaccine process, so that we can communicate clearly and people don't feel like we're, you know, withholding information. So I think that could be considered an intervention in and of itself, is to kind of lead people through that. I think what we've really understood is that interventions are local and contextual and specific to the concerns that we have. But we also know, like, if you take it a level up, you know that healthcare workers are continually trusted for health information, yet they often don't have the tools to be able to communicate what they may know or even not know about a particular health product. So when it comes to, again, the COVID-19 vaccine, is there some sort of training module that we can develop that will increase the capacity of healthcare workers to be able to disseminate accurate knowledge effectively? You know, those are things that you can invest in that up front, and then you sort of downstream prevent people from developing these opinions or having suspicions that are not answered. I mean, I think one of the things I talked about was this worldview, and how if you're more fixed or rigid, it's much harder to change your mind. I think one of the consequences of, you know, the polarization that we live in is that people's worldviews are getting more fixed and are getting more rigid, and it is harder to penetrate those. And I think that's one of the frontiers we're going to have to figure out, how to get through these layers, some of the echo chambers that exist online, some of the ways that we don't necessarily talk to each other anymore, but we like are accessing different content. How are we going to get through those layers of shields between people in order to get this content out? And I think that those don't have easy answers. Like, I don't have the answer, but I'm hoping that we can innovate in this field as we move forward.